Hello.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you see us?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay. So we will start with another talk by Samantha Berthelette, and well, I'll give you a word, and let's do it.
All right, thank you so much for letting me Skype in. I am working on this paper with my co-author, David Rose, who is not with me right now. But this is our first time presenting, so I'd really appreciate any feedback you might have. And I'm going to switch over to a slideshow right now. All right. So, our project is breaking the tension in self-deception. Now, garden variety examples of self-deception often involve some truth that the
I'm
self-deceiver does.
I'm
Hello?
sorry. I'm sorry.
Yes?
You put out the presentation. We didn't see it. We don't have a presentation. If you have a presentation, you can share it.
Oh, is
By
it not
Skype.
showing up on the screen?
No, it's not on the screen.
Oh, interesting. Um, huh. Sorry about that. You do not see anything right now?
Just you.
Oh, interesting. Oh, sorry about that. Is that working now?
Yeah, yeah. Right now it's
Okay,
working.
sorry about that. A little technical difficulties. Okay, starting over. So, garden variety examples of self-deception often involve some truth that the self-deceiver does not want to face. Mother deceives herself into believing that her son is not doing drugs. An overly jealous husband deceives himself into thinking that his wife is having an affair. Maybe a college student is self-deceived about whether he's prepared for tomorrow's exam. But most contemporary accounts of self-deception tend to cast a wider net than just these sorts of cases. Sometimes self-deception results in a belief that the self-deceiver wants to be true. Other times it results in a belief that the self-deceiver does not want to be true. In many cases of self-deception, the resulting belief is false, but in some cases, perhaps due to luck, the resulting belief is true. We might ask then what unifies all cases of self-deception and distinguishes it from other sorts of irrational belief acquisition. But just about every self-deception theorist has their own answer to that question, but most agree that there must be some sort of cognitive tension between the truth and the self-deceptive belief. They claim that tension is necessary for self-deception, and the failure to capture that tension marks an important demerit of the theory. And by the end of this presentation, I hope to persuade you otherwise. So in other words, my aim is to show you why cognitive tension might not be a necessary component of self-deception after all. So to start off, I will begin by explaining some of the background of this debate. So self-deception, sorry about that. Can you still see the PowerPoint?
Yes, yes, but just a part, just the really small
Okay.
part.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, there we go. Self-deception can be broken down into generally one of two categories, different theories. The first category is intentionalism, which describes the nature of self-deception in terms of intentions. Although these accounts come in many varieties, all intentionalist accounts maintain the claim that self-deception occurs when a person intentionally deceives herself. This phenomenon is typically characterized as self-deceivers intentionally making themselves believe P, even though they know not P is true. In this way, intentionalism has the benefit of maintaining many key components often associated with interpersonal deception. So intentionalists hold that self-deception and interpersonal deception both involve a deceiver and a victim. In both cases, the deceiver forms an intention to deceive the victim. Furthermore, that intention to deceive causes the victim to form some unwarranted belief. So what sets self-deception apart from interpersonal deception is just that the deceiver also happens to be the victim. But there are some serious problems with intentionalism. So as Dan Elkin succinctly explains, intentionalism either leads to paradox or, at minimum, to the unnecessary and unsupported postulation of strongly autonomous parts of the mind. This paradox concerns the self-deceiver's purported roles as both deceiver and victim. It is just extremely hard to understand how I can deceive myself into believing that P if I know that not P, I know I'm trying to deceive myself, and I know the exact tactics that I will employ against myself. So at the very least, it seems like an extraordinarily odd case that needs further explanation. As Al Mealy points out, if self-deceivers intentionally deceive themselves, one wonders what prevents the guiding intention from undermining its own effective intention, its own effective functioning. Because of the significant problems that intentionalism encounters, motivationism has become the orthodox way of understanding self-deception. So motivationism holds that self-deception does not need to be intentional. Instead, self-deceptive beliefs are formed through a process of motivationally biased reasoning and evidence collecting. One of the earliest and most influential accounts to explicitly make this distinction belongs to Al Mealy. According to Mealy's motivationist account, self-deception occurs when an agent acquires a false belief by treating evidence in a motivationally biased way. And specifically, this motivational bias is the non-deviant cause of the belief that P, and there's greater warrant for the agent to believe that not P. But since Mealy offered this account in 1997, many self-deception theorists have attempted to build on or improve it. But all motivationists agree that the intentionalist picture is overly restrictive in the following way. Self-deception may sometimes involve intentionally deceiving oneself, but that intention is not required for a case to be one of self-deception. Because they reject the intention criterion, motivationists are able to avoid the problems that intentionalists are faced with. But although motivationalism avoids the problems that intentionalism encounters, many have argued that motivationism fails to adequately capture the cognitive tension involved in self-deception. Robert Audi was among the first to raise this worry against Mealy's account in '97. In order for an account of self-deception to be plausible, he claims, the account must explain the tension that is so obviously inherent to it. My co-author and I refer to this challenge that Audi lays out as the tension challenge. Countless other self-deception theorists since Audi have set the same challenge for motivationists. Michael Lozanski, for example, argues that conflicted mental life is key to understanding the structure of real self-deception. He gestures towards some familiar colloquialisms like, on another level I knew, and I knew all along but refused to accept it. Following Bertrand Russell, George Graham characterizes self-deception as having cognitive discomfort substantiated by doubts, qualms, suspicions, misgivings, and the like. Eric Funkhauser attributes a similarly conflicted mental state to self-deceivers. He argues that self-deception involves both the sincere avowal that P and the belief that not P. Similar claims have been made by Kent Bach, Paul Nordhoff, Steven Pinker, Neil Van Leeuwen, and many others. Now, intentionalists have a relatively easy time meeting the tension challenge. David Pearce, for example, argues that self-deceivers have partitioned psychologies. One part of the self-deceiver's mind believes that P, and it intentionally deceives another part of the mind into believing that not P. Similarly, Donald Davidson accounts for the tension by insisting that the self-deceiver holds two contradictory beliefs. Because intentionalism necessarily involves intentionally deceiving oneself, cognitive tension tends to be naturally present without the burden of incorporating any clunky add-ons to the theory. Instead, the tension challenge has been primarily directed towards motivationist accounts of self-deception. After all, motivationists do not claim that self-deception is relevantly analogous to interpersonal deception. They deny that self-deception necessarily involves as a deceiver and as a deceived. They do not require two simultaneous yet conflicting beliefs, nor do they require that the self-deceiver intentionally deceives herself. Because of all this, it's not immediately clear where the cognitive tension would come in. Still, motivationists have largely accepted the terms of the tension challenge. Rather than arguing against it, they have tended to try modifying the theories in such a way as to account for it. However, my co-author and I argue that the tension challenge is not a serious worry for motivationists. Although cognitive tension is typically present in cases of self-deception, we believe it is not a necessary component. Self-deception can occur even when there is no tension present. No nagging doubts, no conflicting beliefs, no cognitive discomfort. As such, motivationist accounts are not rightly open to criticisms for failing to meet the tension challenge. After all, motivationist accounts do not exclude the possibility of tension being intimately involved in self-deception. They just reject that tension is conceptually necessary for self-deception. If tension is not a necessary component, then accounts that necessitate it are too limiting in their scope. Motivationism offers the flexibility to include tension in the explanatory story when it actually plays a role, but also exclude it from the story when it does not. Still, most self-deception theorists seem to be convinced that tension is a necessary component of self-deception. We argue that it is not, so where do we go from here? One way to overcome the impasse is to try crafting some tension-free examples of self-deception. If we can garner general agreement that certain cases are clear examples of self-deception, even though they exclude the relevant tension, then that would be good evidence that the tension is not required for self-deception. And that is precisely what we did. We constructed 5 cases that lack tension of the sort required by the tension challenge, but we still believe that for at least some of these cases, they are clear instances of self-deception. So for each one of our cases, we had a test version, which we thought to be a clear case of self-deception without cognitive tension, and a control version, which did not include any indices of self-deception. I'll describe some of them briefly, but you can... Yes?
Yeah, yeah.
All set?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So I'll describe some of these cases briefly, but then we can talk more about them in Q&A if you'd like. So this is the first test case. Like I said, there's a test case and a control case. The test case is supposed to be one of self-deception with no cognitive tension, and the control case is supposed to be one that does not involve self-deception components. So this is Eric's essay writing contest. Eric submits an essay he wrote to an essay writing contest. He thought his essay was very good. In fact, on the day that he submitted it, Eric thought to himself that this was one of the best essays he had ever written. Unfortunately, several days later, Eric was notified that he did not win the contest. Each contestant was given feedback about their essays, so Eric read through the feedback he received. Based on the feedback, Eric decided that the judges who received his essay misunderstood certain complex but important components of it. Eric believed that the judges' failure to understand this essay must be the reason why he lost. He was confident that the judges were wrong in their assessment, and there's no doubt in his mind that his essay should have won the contest. Now, although Eric believed that the judges' feedback was unjustified, he was wrong. All of the feedback regarding Eric's essay was completely justified, and any impartial person would have seen that the judges were right to reject his paper. Another case we used is Dan's crush, and in the test case, Dan is very fond of his college classmate Darla. They study together often, but Dan wants more out of the relationship. He very badly wants Darla to be in love with him. Dan thinks that eventually the two of them will be together. Because of his intense feelings for Darla, he sometimes misinterprets her words and actions. When she tells him that she is not interested in dating him, Dan genuinely believes that Darla is just playing hard to get. Dan believes that Darla really does have feelings for him, but Darla's refusals are meant to encourage him to try harder. Dan is convinced that deep down, Darla really does want to be with him. There's no doubt in Dan's mind that Darla is interested in dating him. He confidently believes that she's only pretending to be uninterested, so he will try harder in his pursuit of her. She may act like she doesn't, but there's no doubt in Dan's mind that she loves him. Now, unfortunately for Dan, Darla really does not love him. Her refusals are genuine, and she is not playing hard to get. And like I mentioned before, the control case is the same, except there's no self-deceptive belief. So Dan understands and respects Darla's refusal, knows that Darla does not feel the way, accepts Darla's rejection, and stops pursuing her. And I'll just go through one more of these cases and skip the last two. This one is Jim's bad memory. So Jim is very forgetful. Although he can remember the significant events of his life, he's very bad at remembering the day-to-day details. Jim decides to start keeping a journal so he can look back on those smaller details. When Jim reads his old journal entries, he does not remember the events, nor does he remember writing about them. But because the entries are in his handwriting, he always believes that he wrote them and that the events described must have happened. One day, Jim is feeling a little down. Jim decides to write a lie about himself that would boost his self-confidence in the future. He writes in his journal, "I was particularly brilliant in class today," counting on eventually forgetting that what he wrote was false. A few weeks later, Jim reviews the journal entry. He has completely forgotten what actually happened in class that day. He can tell it's his handwriting, and he has no memory of ever writing lies in his journal, so there's no doubt in Jim's mind that he was particularly brilliant in class that day. And again, in the control case, he actually was brilliant in class that day, and so he later forms a true belief instead of a false one. The next case is about someone who thinks that he has cultivated this skill, which he actually has not cultivated, and it's similar with our final case. So we surveyed 358 people. They were drawn from introductory courses at a large state university in the U.S. 53% of them participated identified as female. The average age was 20, and 97% indicated that English was their native language. Participants were randomly assigned to read one test case along with one control case. The two cases that participants saw never involved the same protagonist. So, for example, if a participant received Eric test, then that participant would not receive Eric control. After reading the case, participants were asked a series of questions. They were first asked a comprehension question, which was passed by 93% of participants. Then we asked whether the participant judged there to be any cognitive tension in the case. And of course, we adjusted each question to fit the actual details of the given case. The manipulation check was highly successful, resulting in 91% of participants judging there to be no tension in the test cases. And participants were then asked if the protagonist was self-deceived about his beliefs and how confident they were about their answer to that self-deception question. Participants in general were highly confident in their answers, and the average confidence rating was about 90%. So as you can see from the graph, condition had a large effect on self-deception in every single case. Follow-up chi-square tests of association for self-deception and condition indicated that 97% of participants indicated that the protagonist was self-deceived in the test cases, and only 24% did across the control cases. So this means that participants overwhelmingly identified the protagonist as self-deceived in the test cases and overwhelmingly denied the claim in control cases. So since participants also overwhelmingly agreed that the protagonist did not experience any cognitive tension in the test cases, our results suggest that, at least on the ordinary view, tension is not necessary for self-deception. Now, you might wonder why folk intuitions matter at all in how we philosophers understand self-deception, but my co-author and I think that failing to at least reconsider one's view according to new evidence of how people understand the concept seems to be a crucial mistake. After all, most accounts of self-deception use intuitions about prototypical examples as their starting point. Self-deception theorists will usually consider various intuitive examples of self-deception and then try to determine what they have in common. They will use examples to support their preferred accounts, and they will use examples to raise objections against other accounts. And as Dana Nelkin explains in her 2002 article, an account of self-deception should minimally be able to include the intuitively clear cases of self-deception and exclude other kinds of irrational belief formation. We believe then that intuitions can be very helpful in setting the boundaries of what ought to count as self-deception. We provide 5 cases that are intuitively clear, we believe, of self-deception that do not include tension, and that's a problem for theorists who stand behind the tension challenge. We believe those theorists have made an unwarranted jump from what is typically a property of self-deception to what they believe is a necessary property of self-deception. And although the results of our survey can't possibly settle the question, we do believe that the results provide a strong reason to question the legitimacy of the tension challenge. At the very least, we've shown that an account's inability to meet the tension challenge is not clearly a reason to reject the account. Since intentionalist accounts face far worse problems than that, motivationism seems to be better equipped than intentionalism to successfully capture the concept of self-deception. And that is it for the talk.
So, thank you very much.
Yeah, let me...
Thank you very much, and yeah, a lot of questions. Okay.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the experiment. I have a question about the design.
Okay.
Basically, well, usually I personally tend to read literature about lying, misleading distinction, for instance. And what happens is that what you have is many participants very often applying a sort of broad understanding of lying, especially if you don't give options such as I don't know, suppose you want to test for people's intuition about the distinction between lying and misleading. To have a really effective test, you need to deploy something like a question, I don't know, for instance, is this lying as opposed to deceiving? Or offer both kind of responses. So you put, is this lying and is this deceiving? So I was wondering, have you put a sort of a question of that sort maybe in one follow-up experiment? And relatedly, do you think it would help? So I was wondering, you know, if I was one of your participants and I was presented with those cases, I would be sure, I don't want to say this is not self-deception because I don't have any other option. So denying self-deception might be read by someone as denying that there is deception at all. And on the other hand, I would wonder, like, if you had a case, like a scenario in which you want to say this is a case of in which a person is deceived, but I wouldn't count it as a case of self-deception. Also there, I was wondering, with a design like the one you presented, maybe people would classify it as self-deception because they don't have the option of saying deception. So they would be like, oh, I might as well, you know, rather than denying that there is self-deception, I would say, yeah, that's self-deception. So yeah, anyway, the worry would be, wouldn't we be better off with a control case, not only for truthfulness, but also for deception, and with a different question design in which I offer, you know, basically I make it salient that what I want from the participant is not just a broad use of the word self-deception, but rather self-deception as opposed to deception, as opposed to other things. So yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question, and that is something that we have thought about. So we are in the process right now of starting a second follow-up study. Very early stages, which is why I haven't even included it in this talk, but we're planning on addressing exactly that worry. So we want to use cases to see whether people actually identify them as self-deception or wishful thinking or delusions or simply being mistaken or some other form of deception. So we are going to specifically ask, which of these, we haven't exactly figured out how we're going to word it yet, but it'll essentially be which of these fits most closely with how you would describe what's going on here. And so, yeah, I think that's a very good point. It's something that we've thought a lot about, and it's definitely going to be part of a follow-up study that we plan on doing in the near future as a part of this. So, thank you.
Hi, yeah, I guess Neri, that's the kind of the question I was going to ask. So let me make it sharper. So, what we need to take the Dan and Darla, I think. So, I can be said to be deceived, or just I can be said to be mistaken, and nobody put me into that state. No other agent, deceived me. And so, what I want is a case where Dan, is mistaken about the fact that Darla is not interested in him, and has, interprets various things, but we would classify that as merely Dan is mistaken about what's going on, versus the self-deceived case. And what I take it to be is that one of the reasons why I would imagine we would have a distinction is that if there's a self-deception case, it does seem, and I guess I'm finding myself supporting the tension supporters, is that it does seem like prima facie there's got to be some contradictory evidence that I'm somehow ignoring, or there's something that would make me in some way responsible for entering into that state as opposed to the normal mistaken case. So I guess it's going to be the tension option, right, is actually right now what would make me differentiate between the deception but not by me and deception by me. So to emphasize this objection that you're not going to get tension if you flatten it out so that I could be read as simply being mistaken about the situation. There's no tension in being mistaken about situations. So the crucial distinction in formulating the Dan and Darla, Mark II, is going to be one where you are giving truly an alternative with the self-deception part, and yet truly without the tension. And that's what I take to be the really hard thing to do.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And this is something that we talk more about in the paper, because obviously we want to distinguish between cases of self-deception and just normal cases of mistake. And where that's going to come in on the motivationist account is through this process of motivational bias, evidence collecting, and motivationally biased belief formation. So according to Al Mealy's account, this sort of thing might happen if you really want something to be true, and so you tend to look at evidence for it as weighing an unproportionally high amount for that desired conclusion. Or if you really don't want something to be true, you count evidence against it as much lower than it should be counted. So that sort of thing counts as this motivational bias. And we just want to argue that that kind of motivational bias doesn't necessarily involve this sort of cognitive tension, split mind kind of phenomenon that a lot of self-deception theorists think that it necessarily does. Now that's not to say that most cases of self-deception don't involve tension. I think that a lot of them do, only that on the motivationist account, it doesn't necessarily involve tension, and we think that we can pick up a distinction between self-deception and ordinary cases of mistake and other irrational belief acquisition processes using this motivational bias. And you're right to point out that I didn't really flesh that out very much in the presentation, but that is something that we go into more in the paper. So thank you for that.
Hey, thanks very much. I enjoyed that a lot, and actually hope you're right. So thanks. I wonder, I guess you diagnose the mistake defenders of attention account make in terms of confusing what's typical for what's essential or what's necessary. I wonder if part of it too, and this is, I'm just asking you for your own view, whether the view was that at least early versions of motivationalism were taken not to have the capacity to, since we're explaining motivational bias belief, full belief, robust belief, that whether they were taken not to have the capacity, I mean, whether there's something more theoretical going on in terms of defending something like a tension-based account, that is, those early accounts didn't have the capacity to explain, you know, the sort of tension taken to be typical by these folks. Just curious about your view.
Yeah, that definitely seems right to me. Because intentionalism was the predominant theory since, like, from the earlier accounts, and it wasn't until Al-Mili came in with his motivationist account that people even started making this distinction. A lot of the self-deception theories were having two contradictory beliefs, or like literally intentionally deceiving yourself. And it wasn't until later on that people started to question that was really just a hard thing to conceptualize, and it didn't seem like that happened a lot, if ever. And so, yeah, I think that that's part of it. As the different theories of self-deception have come about and as they've evolved, it seems like a lot of theories, as with so many areas of philosophy, when they progress, they tend to hang on to some aspects of previous theories, and I'm sure that's part of what's going on here too. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thanks.
So we've got the time for a last question.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, my concern was similar to Neri's. So the first concern. So some of the cases, you know, the case where I deceive my future self by writing the wrong thing in my diary.
Right.
That's an old example, you know. So many philosophers don't see that as self-deception. They see it as self-induced deception. So Sorensen had a paper that if I deceive my future self, that's self-deception. Bermudez had one paper. But many philosophers are not going to take that as a case of self-deception that we are genuinely interested in analyzing, you know. So that was concern about the case. Most of your cases I can recognize, those are Melez cases, so that's a nice idea. Yeah. And you seem to approach the issue from Elian perspective. But I wonder, you know, how often do you hear people say he's self-deceived or she's self-deceived? You know, that's not what we hear in common language. So when you frame the question that way, I'm not really sure that your participants know what they're saying when they're responding to a question. Is the person deceived about themselves? Is the self deceived, which is like the self is having a false belief? So I'm not really. So I really think that you need a follow-up experiment. I also think that can I just also you need to know. You seem to be the design of the experiment seems to assume that if we confirm Melez's approach, you know, in this way, Melez's approach is problematic. You know, people think is any kind of motivated reasoning self-deception? Melez's approach is problematic in the sense that it might be too wide, and it's not big news. You know, we all know that. So maybe your control case could be a case of motivated reasoning that doesn't count as self-deception. Maybe your control case could be a case of what would satisfy Melez's conditions, because Melez's position is subtle because it's a set of sufficient conditions, not necessary conditions. So he is not denying tension, and I understand why you picked that position. Okay, so those were just some unsolicited suggestions. I apologize for my tone.
No.
But I like to talk.
No, that's quite all right.
Yeah, okay. Disregard the angry face and stuff. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think those are good points. We tried to address some of that with like the confidence rating and how You're right. We don't typically say the person is self-deceived. We're hoping to address more of that with this follow-up study, where hopefully we can distinguish between being a case of being self-deception versus wishful thinking versus delusion. And so I think you're right to point that stuff out. We're hoping to be able to assuage those worries a little bit more in follow-up studies. And again, we don't necessarily want to accept Mealy's conclusion, Mealy's account as it is. As I see the debate, a lot of motivationist accounts since Mealy have often just been either trying to add necessary conditions to his account, narrow it in scope, those sorts of things. And so I took Mealy's account as just like kind of a broad baseline kind of account without having to commit to any particular necessary components first. And so, yeah, I think there's a follow-up question to that.
Yes. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Have you considered testing revisionist accounts of self-deception? So in your introduction, you mentioned, traditionalists and deflationists, but you don't mention revisionists or hybrid accounts. So now you just mentioned hybrid accounts like Holton's and stuff. Have you tried to find a really, really revisionist account of self-deception like Patton's account, which doesn't require intention at all, or Jordi Fernandez's account of self-deception? Get that case out there, test people's intuitions, and then you can see, what kind of conception people they have. Because if people think it's self-deception just because you have a false belief, and this is not what you're testing, then you want a control case to know that. So if I were you, I would consider testing some really, extravagant accounts of self-deception, which are brilliant. You can try that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good suggestion.
Yeah. That was a really good paper. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for the comments. That was super helpful, and I really appreciate you having me Skype in today.
So thank you again.
Yep.
Okay, and goodbye.
Goodbye.